At 3:42 inches the morning on March 15, 2019, a single gunshot shattered the silence of a quiet motel parking lot in rural Ohio. When police arrived at the Ridgeway Motel, they found a young woman slumped in the driver's seat of a silver Honda Accord, a gunshot wound to her right temple, her hand still warm but her pulse fading. On the passenger seat lay a 9mm handgun, and tucked beneath it, a leather wallet containing the ID of Robert Daniels, one of the most powerful corrections officials in the state. The woman's name was Lexus Ray, though her family had known her as Tamika Lawson. She was 27 years old, a dancer at a gentleman's club in Columbus, and according to the initial police report, she had just taken her own life. But as investigators would soon discover, nothing about that night was as simple as it seemed. Because Lexus wasn't just a dancer. She was an informant. She carried a secret that could destroy careers, and in the weeks before her death, she had been planning to expose a web of corruption that reached deep into Ohio's Department of Corrections. This is her story, and the question that still haunts everyone who knew her. Did Lexus Ray pull that trigger, or did someone else want her silenced forever? Welcome to Silent Witness True Crime Stories. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe, and also download your free ebook by clicking the link in the pinned comment. Tamika Lawson grew up in West Dayton, in a neighborhood where chain-link fences separated small yards and sirens were more common than birdsong. Her mother worked double shifts at a packaging plant. Her father had left when she was 6, and by the time Tamika turned 16, she understood that survival meant making hard choices. She was smart, her teachers said so, got good grades in English and history, dreamed of maybe going to community college and becoming a paralegal or a teacher. But when her mother got sick during Tamika's senior year of high school, medical bills piled up faster than paychecks could cover them. Tamika graduated, but college became a fantasy she couldn't afford. At 19, working 2 minimum-wage jobs and barely making rent, Tamika walked into a club called The Velvet Room on a Friday night, not as a customer but as someone desperate enough to audition. The manager, a man named Tony with gold rings on every finger, looked her up and down and said she'd do just fine. That night, Tamika became Lexus Ray. The name felt powerful, like armor. On stage, under colored lights with bass pounding through the floor, she could be someone else. Someone confident and untouchable. The money was better than anything she'd made before, enough to cover bills and send some home to her mother. But the work came with a price she hadn't anticipated. At 23, Tamika met a man at a private event the club hosted for local professionals and businessmen. His name was Robert Daniels, 46 years old, married with 2 teenage daughters, and he worked as a warden at Marion Correctional Institution, one of Ohio's medium-security prisons. He was well-dressed, polite, different from the usual customers who grabbed and leered. He asked her real name, and when she hesitated, he smiled and said he understood. Over the next few months, Robert became a regular, always requesting private dances, always generous with tips, always asking questions about her life like he genuinely cared. Tamika knew better than to trust men like him, men who wanted more than they paid for, but Robert seemed different. He listened. He didn't make her feel cheap, and when he offered to help her with rent 1 month after she mentioned falling behind, she accepted. That was how it started, with small favors and quiet conversations, until one night Robert suggested they meet outside the club, somewhere private. Tamika agreed, and they began an affair that would last nearly 3 years, conducted in motel rooms and parked cars, always in secret, always on his terms. For a while, Tamika convinced herself it was something more than transactional. Robert brought her gifts, paid for her car repairs, even helped her move into a better apartment. He talked about his unhappy marriage, his demanding job, how being with her made him feel alive again. She wanted to believe him, but slowly the relationship shifted. Robert became possessive, calling her at odd hours to check where she was, who she was with. He didn't like when she danced for other men, even though that was her job. He started making decisions for her, controlling when they met, how often, under what conditions. And then, One night, after they'd been together for nearly 2 years, Tamika told him something she'd been hiding since before they met. She was HIV positive. She'd contracted it years earlier from a boyfriend who hadn't told her he was infected, and she'd been on medication ever since, managing it, living with it. She'd been afraid to tell Robert, afraid he'd leave, but she couldn't keep lying. When she finally said the words, sitting across from him in a motel room off Route 23, Robert's face changed. The warmth drained from his eyes. He stood up, paced the room, ran his hands through his hair, and then he asked the question that would set everything in motion. Had she infected him? Tamika didn't know. They'd been careful sometimes, reckless other times. She urged him to get tested, said they'd figure it out together, but Robert wasn't interested in figuring anything out together. Over the next few weeks, he became distant, cold. He stopped returning her calls. When she showed up at places she knew he'd be, he avoided her. And then, 3 months after she told him, Robert called her late one night, his voice tight with anger. He'd tested positive, he was HIV positive, and he blamed her. Tamika tried to explain, tried to apologize, but Robert cut her off. He told her she'd ruined his life, that if his wife found out, if anyone at the Department of Corrections found out, his career would be over, his family destroyed. He said she needed to stay quiet, that if she ever told anyone about their relationship or his diagnosis, he'd make sure she regretted it. Tamika didn't know if he meant it as a threat or just anger talking, but the tone in his voice scared her. For the first time since they'd met, she realized Robert Daniels wasn't the man she thought he was, and that realization would eventually cost her everything. By early 2019, Tamika had had enough. The affair had turned toxic, Robert's threats more frequent, his control suffocating. She stopped answering his calls, blocked his number, told friends at the club she was done with him, but Robert didn't let go easily. He showed up outside her apartment one night, banging on her door, demanding to talk. When she wouldn't let him in, he sat in his car for hours, just watching her windows. Tamika was terrified, but she didn't know who to turn to. Reporting him meant exposing the affair, admitting she'd been involved with a married government official, risking her own reputation and safety. So she stayed silent until she couldn't anymore. In late February, Tamika reached out to a friend who worked as a paralegal, someone she'd known since high school. She explained the situation, the affair, the diagnosis, Robert's threats. Her friend listened, and then suggested something Tamika hadn't considered: going to the authorities. Not the police, but the Ohio Inspector General's office, which investigated corruption and misconduct in state agencies. If Robert had been using state resources to fund their affair, meeting her during work hours, using his position to manipulate her, that was a crime. Tamika wasn't sure at first, didn't want to be seen as a snitch, but her friend convinced her. This wasn't just about her and Robert anymore. This was about holding someone accountable who thought he was untouchable. On March 1st, 2019, Tamika sent an anonymous letter to the Inspector General's office, detailing her relationship with Warden Robert Daniels. She didn't sign her name, but she included enough specifics, dates, locations, receipts from motels and restaurants Robert had paid for with what she suspected were state funds to make the allegations credible. She also mentioned his HIV diagnosis, not to shame him, but to show how desperate he'd become to keep everything hidden. She wrote that she feared for her safety, that Robert had threatened her, that she didn't know what he was capable of. Then she waited. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. No calls, no follow-up, nothing. Tamika started to think the letter had been ignored, or worse, that it had somehow made its way back to Robert. Life. Lokes and lows, one rom rombard. When the pensruv and one friesen of gupta video with sialast, with Cresio West. And then, on March 13th, 2 days before her death, Tamika received a text message from an unknown number. It said, "We need to talk. Stop what you're doing or you'll regret it." She didn't respond, but she screenshotted the message and sent it to her friend, the paralegal, along with a note. "If anything happens to me, Make sure they see this. On the night of March 14th, Tamika finished her shift at the Velvet Room around midnight. She seemed nervous. Co-workers would later tell police, kept checking her phone, looking toward the door like she was expecting someone. Around 1 a.m., she left the club alone, got into her silver Honda Accord, and drove east toward the Ridgeway Motel, a place she'd been to many times before with Robert. Surveillance footage from a gas station 2 miles from the motel captured her car passing by at 1:23 a.m. She was alone, but phone records would later show that between 1:30 and 2:15 a.m., Tamika made 3 calls, all to Robert Daniels' cell phone. He answered the first 2, each call lasting less than a minute. The third went to voicemail. At 2:47 a.m., a motel guest reported hearing a single gunshot from the parking lot. When police arrived 6 minutes later, they found Tamika slumped in the driver's seat, the engine still running, a gunshot wound to her right temple. The gun, a 9mm Glock registered to Robert Daniels, lay on the passenger seat. His wallet was tucked beneath the gun, and his fingerprints were on the door handle and dashboard. On Tamika's phone, still clutched in her left hand, was an unsent text message that read, "He knows I told. If something happens to me, it was him." Robert Daniels was brought in for questioning the next morning. He admitted to the affair, said it had been a mistake, that Tamika had become obsessed with him after he tried to end things. He claimed he hadn't seen her in weeks, that he had no idea how his gun and wallet ended up in her car. He suggested she must have stolen them, that she'd been unstable, threatening to hurt herself if he didn't take her back. When detectives pointed out the phone calls from the night she died, Robert said she'd been harassing him, that he'd only answered to tell her to leave him alone. As for the gun, he said he kept it in his car, and that Tamika must have taken it weeks earlier without him noticing. It was a story full of holes, and detectives knew it. But Robert Daniels was a powerful man with connections, and within 48 hours of Tamika's death, the case was handed over to a different investigative unit, one with ties to the Department of Corrections. The official ruling came fast: suicide. Tamika Lawson, stage name Lexus Ray, had taken her own life in a moment of emotional distress. Case closed. Except it wasn't closed. Not for Tamika's family. Not for the paralegal friend who had the text messages. Not for the handful of investigators who knew something wasn't right. 3 months after Tamika's death, her autopsy report was finally released to her family after they fought through legal red tape to obtain it. What they found contradicted the official suicide ruling. Gunpowder residue was present on the passenger seat and the right side of Tamika's face, but critically, there was minimal residue on her right hand, the hand that supposedly held the gun when it fired. Forensic experts consulted by the family explained that in close-range gunshot suicides, significant residue is almost always found on the hand that fired the weapon. The residue pattern suggested the gun had been fired from a position near Tamika, but not necessarily by her. Additionally, the angle of the bullet's entry, slightly downward from right to left, was inconsistent with a self-inflicted wound from someone right-handed, which Tamika was. The autopsy also noted bruising on Tamika's left wrist and shoulder, injuries that hadn't been mentioned in the initial police report. When reporters began asking questions, citing the autopsy findings and the anonymous letter Tamika had sent to the Inspector General, pressure mounted on the state to reopen the investigation. But by then, Robert Daniels had quietly resigned from his position, citing personal health reasons. He refused to speak to media, hired a lawyer, and within 6 months had relocated to another state. No charges were ever filed. The case remains officially closed as a suicide, though Tamika's family continues to push for justice. What makes Tamika's story so troubling isn't just the circumstances of her death, but the pattern that emerged afterward. In the months following the investigation, journalists uncovered that Tamika wasn't the only dancer Robert Daniels had been involved with. At least 2 other women from clubs in Columbus and Cleveland came forward anonymously, saying they'd also had relationships with him, that he'd used his position and money to control them, and that when they tried to end things, he'd become threatening. One woman said Robert had paid her to keep quiet after she threatened to expose him to his wife. Another said he'd shown up at her home unannounced, making her feel unsafe. Both women were also HIV positive, though neither would confirm whether Robert was the source of their infection. When reporters tried to interview Robert about these allegations, his lawyer issued a statement denying all claims of wrongdoing and threatening legal action against anyone who published defamatory information. The women stopped talking publicly, and the story faded from headlines. But for those who knew Tamika, the message was clear. Powerful men could get away with almost anything, the use clivert, but I way faded with thousands for midicast. And women like her, women who danced for money, who lived on the margins, were disposable in the eyes of a system that valued reputation over truth. Today, more than 5 years after her death, Tamika's grave sits in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Dayton, marked by a simple headstone that reads, Tamika Lawson, beloved daughter and friend. Her mother visits every week, bringing flowers and sitting on the grass, talking to her daughter about all the things they never got to do together. Tamika's friends from the club have mostly moved on. Some left the industry, others still dance under different names in different cities. The Velvet Room closed 2 years after Tamika died, not because of her death but because the owner retired and no one wanted to buy a place with that kind of history. Robert Daniels, as far as anyone knows, lives quietly somewhere in the South, his name absent from public records, his past carefully erased. The Ohio Inspector General's office never followed up on Tamika's letter, and the investigation into potential misuse of state funds was quietly dropped. For the system, Tamika's death was a problem solved by silence. But for her family, for the people who loved her, the question remains, what really happened in that car on March 15, 2019? Think about it for a moment. Here was a young woman, someone who'd made mistakes, who lived a complicated life, but who was also trying to hold a powerful man accountable for what he'd done to her. She sent that letter knowing it could put her in danger. She saved those text messages, knowing they might be the only proof she had. And then, on a cold March night, she ended up dead in a car with a gun that wasn't hers and a wallet that tied her directly to the man she'd accused. How do you see that and call it suicide? How do you look at the evidence, the pattern of control and threats, the gunpowder residue that doesn't match, and decide that a young woman simply gave up? The answer is, you don't. Not unless you're protecting someone, not unless the truth is more inconvenient than the lie. Because it's not just about her. It's about every person who's been silenced by power, every victim who's been labeled as unreliable or unstable because of who they are or how they make a living. It's about a system that values certain lives over others, and the cost of that imbalance. So let me ask you, because I really want to know what you think. Do you believe Tamika pulled that trigger? Or do you think someone else decided her story needed to end that night? Put yourself in her position for a moment. Imagine you've been used, manipulated, infected with a disease that will follow you for life, and when you try to speak up, you're threatened and dismissed. Imagine you reach out for help, send letters, save evidence, and still, no one listens. Would you give up? Would you end your own life in a place tied to your abuser, with his gun, his wallet, his fingerprints all over the scene, or would you fight? Right up until the moment someone took that choice away from you. I think most of us know the answer. Tamika fought. She fought by writing that letter, by saving those messages, by calling Robert that night, probably trying to reason with him one last time. And I think someone decided that fight was too dangerous to let continue. Was it Robert? Was it someone connected to him? Someone with just as much to lose? We may never know for sure, but the evidence suggests Tamika didn't die by her own hand. She was silenced, and that silence should terrify all of us, because it means the people who are supposed to protect us, the systems designed to deliver justice, failed her completely. Tamika's story also raises bigger questions about how we treat people in industries like the one she worked in. Dancers, sex workers, people on the margins of society, they're often the first to be dismissed when something goes wrong, the first to be blamed, the first to have their testimony questioned, but they're also human beings with families, dreams, fears, and the same right to safety and justice as anyone else. Tamika didn't deserve what happened to her. Not the manipulation, not the infection, not the threats, and certainly not her death. She deserved to be heard. She deserved an investigation that actually sought the truth instead of protecting the powerful. And she deserved a system that valued her life as much as it valued Robert Daniels' reputation. But she didn't get any of that. Instead, she got a rushed ruling, a closed case, and a grave that hardly anyone visits except her mother. That's the cost of silence. That's what happens when we decide some lives matter less than others. And it's why stories like Tamika's need to be told, over and over, until we can't ignore them anymore. If you've made it this far, I want you to do something for me. I want you to remember Tamika's name. Not Lexus Ray, the stage name she used to survive, but Tamika Lawson, the woman who loved her mother, who dreamed of a better life, who fought back against a man who thought he could control her. Remember her story the next time you hear about a case that gets dismissed too quickly, or a victim who gets blamed for their own death. Ask questions. Demand better. Because if we don't, if we just accept the easy answers and move on, then we're complicit in the silence that killed her. And I don't know about you, but I'm not okay with that. Tamika deserved justice. She still does. And until her case is reopened, until someone with the courage and authority to investigate properly takes another look at the evidence, her story won't be finished. It'll just be another tragedy we chose to forget. Remember that she mattered. And remember that somewhere out there, someone knows exactly what happened in that car, and they've been living with that knowledge for over 5 years. Maybe one day, they'll decide the weight of that secret is too much to carry. Maybe one day, the truth will finally come out. Until then, all we can do is keep asking, keep pushing, and keep saying her name. Tamika Lawson. She was 27 years old. She was someone's daughter, and she deserved so much better than the ending she got.